Frederick Harris sent the wedding invitation to his ex-wife for one reason, to humiliate her. He expected Randy Hedge to arrive alone, dressed in discount store clothes, her head bowed in shame. But when the sleek black luxury sedan glided to a stop on the red carpet and Randy stepped out in a shimmering gold gown, the crowd fell silent. The man whose arm she held wasn't just any guest, it was Fred's own billionaire father. And that was just the beginning of everything Fred had built crumbling to dust. Before we dive into this devastating revelation, subscribe to the channel so you're always first to know when we expose the truth. Hit like if you're ready for the next shocking discovery, and comment where you're watching from, New York, Atlanta, or maybe Dallas. Alright, let's continue with Fred as he uncovers his shocking moments. Once upon a time, in the gleaming heart of a city where ambition towered as high as the skyscrapers, there lived a man named Fred Harris. He was a successful businessman in his mid-30s, the kind of man who turned heads wherever he went. Everyone who knew him understood one thing: Fred lived for appearances. He wore Italian suits tailored to perfection, drove cars that cost more than most people's homes, and carried himself with the kind of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His shoes were always polished, his watch always expensive, and his smile always calculated. He walked through life as though the ordinary ground beneath him wasn't quite worthy of his steps. He was proud, loud, and obsessed with making sure everyone around him knew exactly how successful he'd become. But behind the designer suits, behind the luxury penthouse with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, behind the carefully curated social media posts of champagne toasts and exclusive events, there was something that ate at Fred every single day. Something that threatened the perfect image he'd worked so hard to build. His wife didn't fit anymore. Randy Hedge was a quiet and gentle woman. She had soft brown eyes that seemed to hold kindness even when they reflected pain, and a voice that never rose above what was necessary. She was beautiful in an understated way, natural, graceful, with a warmth that didn't need designer labels to shine through. Randy had married Fred out of love, not for his money or his status. For nearly 8 years, she had stood by his side through the late nights, the business struggles, the early days when success was still just a dream. But those 8 years had slowly transformed into years of invisible wounds, because every day Fred looked at her, and every day he saw the same thing, a woman who no longer matched the life he wanted to project. She didn't wear the right brands. She didn't network with the right people. She didn't sparkle at events the way Fred needed her to. And in Fred's world, that made her a liability. One evening, the tension that had been building like storm clouds for months finally broke. The penthouse was quiet, almost too quiet. The city lights twinkled through the massive windows, but inside, the air felt heavy, suffocating. Randy sat on the edge of the leather couch, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her heart pounding with a dread she couldn't name. Fred stood across the room near the window, his tie loosened, his expression cold and distant. He looked at her the way someone might look at a piece of furniture they were planning to replace. "I can't do this anymore, Randy," Fred said, his voice sharp and businesslike, as though he were closing a deal. Randy's breath caught in her throat. "Do what, Fred?" "This." He gestured vaguely between them, his face twisted with irritation. "You. Us. This whole situation. It's not working." She stood slowly, her voice trembling but steady. "If this is about money, we can figure it out together. We've overcome challenges before. It's not about money." Fred snapped, finally turning to face her fully. His eyes were cold, detached. "It's about you. You don't fit, Randy. You never really did. I need someone who elevates me. Someone who looks the part. Someone people respect when they see us together." The words landed like physical blows. "What are you saying?" she whispered. Fred exhaled sharply, adjusting his watch as if this conversation was wasting his precious time. "I'm saying I want a divorce. You can stay until the end of the month. After that, I'll need you gone. I've already spoken to my lawyer." Randy stood frozen, her world splintering in slow motion. The man she'd loved, the man she'd supported through every struggle, was discarding her like she was nothing. "Fred, please. There's nothing to discuss," he said flatly, turning back to the window. "This is for the best. For both of us." But they both knew he meant for himself. But their marriage hadn't always been cold. Once, there had been laughter. Once, there had been dreams they built together in a tiny apartment with second-hand furniture and hope as their only currency. To understand how love died, you have to understand how it lived first. 7 years earlier, Frederick Harris was a different man, or at least, he seemed to be. He was ambitious, yes, but his ambition felt like fuel for their future, not a fire that would eventually burn everything down. Back then, he and Randy shared a cramped one-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city, the kind of place where the radiator clanked at night and the neighbors' arguments bled through paper-thin walls. But inside those 4 walls, they built something real. Fred would come home from late meetings, exhausted but excited, and Randy would have dinner waiting, nothing fancy, just pasta or stir-fry, whatever their budget allowed. They'd sit cross-legged on the floor because their table was too small, and Fred would talk about his plans. Not in the polished, performative way he would later speak at networking events, but with genuine passion. He wanted to build something meaningful. He wanted to prove himself. And Randy believed in him with the kind of faith that can't be manufactured. "We're going to make it, Randy," he'd say, squeezing her hand across their makeshift dinner setup. "One day, we won't have to worry about rent or bills or any of this. I promise." And she'd smile, squeezing back. "I know we will. We're a team." Back then, that's what they were. A team. But success, when it came with conditions Fred hadn't anticipated. His first major business deal changed everything. Suddenly, there were invitations to exclusive events, introductions to influential people, opportunities that required the right appearance, the right connections, the right. Fred began to notice things he'd never cared about before, how other men's wives dressed, how they spoke, how they commanded attention in a room. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to measure Randy against them. The first crack appeared at a company gala 6 months after Fred's promotion. Randy had worn a simple navy dress, elegant, understated, perfectly appropriate. But the moment they walked into the ballroom, Fred's jaw tightened. The other wives glittered in designer gowns and statement jewelry. They laughed too loud, smiled too bright, performed their roles with practiced precision. "You look nice," Fred had said, but the word felt hollow, almost apologetic. Randy noticed but said nothing. She never liked being the center of attention anyway. Throughout the evening, Fred introduced her to colleagues and clients, but his enthusiasm dimmed each time. When one of his business partner's wives, a woman named Sienna with platinum hair and a dress that probably cost more than their monthly rent, leaned in to air-kiss Randy, her eyes swept over Randy's outfit with barely concealed amusement. "Oh, how refreshing," Sienna said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Someone who doesn't feel the need to try so hard. I love that confidence." It was an insult wrapped in a compliment, and everyone at the table knew it. Polite laughter rippled around them. Fred's face flushed, but he said nothing. He just sipped his champagne and looked away. That night, driving home in silence, Randy finally spoke. "I'm sorry if I embarrassed you." "You didn't embarrass me," Fred said quickly. Too quickly. "It's fine. It's just, these events matter, Randy. First impressions matter. People judge us based on how we present ourselves. I thought they judged us based on our work. Our character. Fred's hands tightened on the steering wheel. In a perfect world, maybe. But this isn't a perfect world. Randy turned to look out the window, her reflection ghostly in the dark glass. Something in his tone felt like a door closing. The incidents multiplied. At a networking dinner, Fred laughed along when a colleague joked that Randy was clearly the brains and the beauty of the operation, the implication being that Fred couldn't possibly have both. At a charity auction, when Randy politely declined to bid on an overpriced handbag, Fred pulled her aside afterward. "You made us look cheap," he hissed. "We don't need a $5,000 purse, Fred. That's not who we are." "That's not who you are," he shot back. "But it's who I'm becoming. And I need you to keep up." The words hung between them like smoke. Randy tried. She really did. She bought a few nicer outfits, attended events with a smile plastered on her face, made small talk with people who felt like strangers even after a dozen conversations. But she refused to become someone she wasn't. She wouldn't fake enthusiasm for things that didn't matter. She wouldn't laugh at jokes that weren't funny. She wouldn't perform. And Fred resented her for it. The warmth that had once filled their apartment disappeared, replaced by a cold politeness. Fred started coming home later. He stopped asking about her day. Their conversations became transactional, schedules, bills, obligations. The man who once held her hand across a too-small table now barely looked at her across their king-sized bed. Randy lay awake many nights, staring at the ceiling, wondering when exactly she'd become the problem. She'd chosen peace over confrontation so many times that she'd lost count. Every dismissive comment, every subtle comparison, every moment he looked at her like she was a disappointment, she'd swallowed them all. Because she believed that love, real love, meant choosing understanding over ego. But Fred had made a different choice. He'd chosen his image over his wife. His status over his vows. His hunger for validation over the quiet, steady love they'd once shared. The final withdrawal happened on a Tuesday evening. Fred came home, barely acknowledged her presence, poured himself a scotch, and disappeared into his home office. When Randy knocked gently on the door an hour later, he didn't even look up from his laptop. "Fred, can we talk?" "I'm busy." "It'll just take a minute." "Randy." He finally looked at her, and his eyes were empty. "I said I'm busy. We can talk some other time." But that other time never came. And somewhere deep in her heart, Randy knew the man she'd married was already gone. The divorce papers arrived on a Thursday morning, delivered by a courier in a crisp uniform who had no idea he was handing over the end of someone's world. Randy stood in the doorway of their penthouse, his penthouse now, she supposed, holding the manila envelope with trembling hands. Fred had already left for the office. No conversation. No final attempt at reconciliation. Just legal documents and a post-it note stuck to the kitchen counter that read, "My lawyer will be in touch. Please don't make this difficult." As if she ever had. The divorce itself was clean, clinical, almost unnervingly efficient. Fred's attorney was expensive and thorough, the kind of lawyer who wore $1,000 suits and spoke in carefully measured tones designed to make you feel small without ever raising his voice. Randy sat across from him in a conference room that smelled of leather and old money, and listened as he laid out the terms with the emotional investment of someone reading a grocery list. Fred would keep the penthouse. That was non-negotiable, it was in his name, purchased before the marriage, despite the fact that Randy had helped furnish it, had made it feel like a home instead of a showroom. Fred would keep their shared social circle, Most of them were his business contacts anyway, people who smiled at Randy at parties but never actually knew her. She wouldn't be cut out deliberately, she'd simply cease to exist in their world, like a profile deleted from social media. Fred would keep the financial security. The investments, the savings accounts, the carefully built portfolio that Randy had contributed to during the early years when she worked 2 jobs to help keep them afloat while Fred built his business. His lawyer had found creative ways to ensure most of it remained his. And what does Mrs. Harris receive? Randy's court-appointed attorney asked, his voice thin and defeated before the negotiation even began. Fred's lawyer slid a document across the table. A settlement of $50,000, to be paid in full within 30 days. Mrs. Harris keeps her personal vehicle and any belongings she brought into the marriage. We believe this is more than fair given the short duration of the marriage and Mrs. Harris's minimal financial contribution to Mr. Harris's business success. Minimal contribution, the words landed like a slap. Randy had worked 60-hour weeks in those early years. She'd answered phones, organized files, proofread proposals at midnight, celebrated Fred's victories as if they were her own. She believed they were building something together. But on paper, in this sterile room with its recessed lighting and polished mahogany table, her contribution had been reduced to a single word, minimal. She could have fought. Her attorney told her as much, quietly, outside the conference room. But fighting meant months of legal battles, tens of thousands in attorney fees she couldn't afford, and the very real possibility of ending up with less than what was currently offered. More importantly, fighting meant staying connected to Fred, staying trapped in his orbit, and Randy was tired of shrinking herself to fit into his shadow. "I'll sign," she said simply. Her attorney looked at her with something between pity and respect. "Are you sure?" Randy nodded. She wasn't sure of much anymore, but she was sure of this: she needed to be free more than she needed to be right. The whispers started before the ink on the divorce papers had dried. At the grocery store, Randy caught the tail end of a conversation between 2 women she vaguely recognized from Fred's social events. "Such a shame. I always knew she wasn't cut out for that lifestyle. Poor Fred, imagine being tied down to someone so ordinary." At the coffee shop where she'd once met friends, Fred's friends, really, the barista who used to know her order by heart now looked through her as if she were invisible. The regular customers who once exchanged pleasantries now found their phones suddenly fascinating when she walked in. The narrative was already written, already circulating through their circles like a virus: Randy was the failure. The wife who couldn't keep up. The woman who wasn't enough. And Fred, charming, successful Fred, was the victim of an unfortunate mismatch, now free to find someone more suitable. No one asked for her side of the story. No one wondered what it cost her to walk away. In their world, the one with the most money controlled the story, and Fred's story painted Randy as nothing more than a footnote in his climb to success. The final scene of Randy's old life played out in a studio apartment on the east side of the city, in a building where the elevator sometimes worked and the hallway smelled faintly of cooking spices and old carpet. It was a universe away from the penthouse with its panoramic views and marble countertops. The entire apartment could fit inside their old master bedroom. Randy stood in the center of the empty space on moving day, though moving was generous. She had 3 suitcases, 2 boxes of books, and a few pieces of art she'd bought at a street fair years ago. Everything else had belonged to Fred's world. She should have felt devastated. Broken. She should have picked up the phone and begged Fred for another chance, promised to be different, to try harder, to become whoever he needed her to be. But as Randy set down her suitcases and looked around the small, sunlit space, something unexpected stirred in her chest. Not quite hope, it was too soon for that, but something quieter. Something like possibility. She still had her education. The degree she'd earned while working full-time, the knowledge no lawyer could divide up in a settlement agreement. She still had her integrity, even if it felt like cold comfort in a studio apartment with second-hand furniture. She still had her name, her voice, her sense of self, all the things she'd nearly lost trying to fit into Fred's carefully curated life. And she had something else, something Fred would never understand. She had the freedom to rebuild herself without needing anyone's permission. Randy walked to the window and looked out at the city. From here, she couldn't see the gleaming towers where Fred conducted his business. She couldn't see the luxury venues where his new life would unfold. She could only see ordinary streets with ordinary people living ordinary lives, working, loving, struggling, surviving. And for the first time in years, she felt like she belonged. She pulled out her phone, stared at Fred's contact for a long moment, then deleted it. Some doors, once closed, should stay that way. The first month in the studio apartment was the hardest. Randy woke each morning to unfamiliar sounds, the rumble of buses on the street below, the neighbor's alarm clock bleeding through thin walls, the hiss of radiator pipes that never quite warmed the place enough. She'd lie there in the pale morning light, staring at the ceiling with its water stain shaped like a continent she couldn't name, and feel the weight of everything she'd lost pressing down on her chest. But then she'd get up. Because that's what you do when falling apart isn't an option. The settlement money, $50,000 that was supposed to represent 8 years of partnership, sat in her bank account like a countdown clock. Randy did the math obsessively those first few weeks. Rent, utilities, food, basic necessities. At her current burn rate, she had maybe 18 months before she'd be completely broke. The thought should have terrified her. And it did. But it also clarified something: she needed to become someone new. Someone who didn't need Fred's world to survive. She started with the practical things. A financial literacy course at the community center, taught by a retired accountant who wore cardigans with elbow patches and spoke about compound interest with the passion most people reserve for sports teams. Randy sat in the back of the classroom with a mix of college students and older adults, taking notes like her life depended on it. Because it did. She learned about emergency funds, about the difference between assets and liabilities, about how debt could quietly strangle your future while you smiled and swiped your credit card. She learned that wealth wasn't just about how much you earned but how much you kept, how much you invested, how intentionally you lived. These were lessons Fred had never bothered with. He'd always believed more money was the solution to any problem, never understanding that the problem was often how he thought about money in the first place. Next came work. Randy took a position at a nonprofit that helped low-income families with financial planning and housing assistance. The pay was modest, barely enough to cover her expenses, but the work felt real in a way nothing in Fred's world ever had. She helped single mothers understand their rental agreements, taught recent immigrants how to build credit, sat with elderly couples trying to figure out if they could afford their medications. These people didn't care about designer labels or luxury cars. They cared about survival, about dignity, about building something stable for their children. And somewhere in the process of helping them, Randy began to help herself. She enrolled in an online certification program for financial counseling, studying late into the night at her tiny kitchen table with a cup of tea and a determination that surprised her. The woman who'd once apologized for existing in Fred's space was slowly becoming someone who took up space unapologetically. She had opinions now. Expertise. A growing confidence that didn't require anyone's validation. The internal shift was harder to track than the external one. Some days, Randy still felt the ghost of Fred's judgment, the way he'd looked at her with barely concealed disappointment, the way he'd made her feel like she was always one wrong outfit or one awkward comment away from embarrassing him. Those thoughts would creep in during quiet moments, whispering that maybe he'd been right, maybe she really wasn't enough. But then she'd remember the single mother she'd helped that week, the one who'd cried with relief when Randy showed her how to restructure her debt. She'd remember the elderly man who'd shaken her hand and called her a blessing. She'd remember that her worth wasn't determined by how well she performed in someone else's story. Meanwhile, Fred's life continued its upward trajectory, at least on the surface. Randy didn't follow him on social media. She'd blocked all of that the day she deleted his number, but the city had a way of delivering news whether you wanted it or not. Friends of friends would mention seeing him at exclusive restaurants. The business section of the newspaper featured an interview about his latest venture. Once, waiting for the bus, Randy saw an advertisement on a bench with Fred's face on it, promoting some luxury real estate development with the tagline, "Elevate Your Life." She stared at that advertisement for a long moment, and then she smiled. Not bitterly. Just, knowingly. Because she understood now what Fred had never figured out, elevation isn't about height. It's about foundation. 6 months after the divorce, Randy saw a flyer at the nonprofit where she worked. Women in Business Mentorship Program, it read, with details about a new initiative connecting emerging professionals with established leaders in finance and entrepreneurship. Applications were being accepted for the inaugural cohort. Randy almost didn't apply. The old voice, Fred's voice, really, whispered that she wasn't qualified enough, experienced enough, impressive enough. But the new voice, the one she was carefully cultivating, asked a different question: what if you are? She submitted her application on a Tuesday evening, sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop and a growing sense that something was shifting, though she couldn't yet see the shape of it. 3 weeks later, she received an acceptance email. She'd been selected as one of 20 women for the program, which was funded by the Harris Foundation, a name that meant nothing to her at the time. Randy read the email twice, then closed her laptop and sat in the quiet of her small apartment. Through the window, the city stretched out in 1,000 points of light, each one representing someone's story, someone's struggle, someone's quiet triumph. She didn't know it yet, but her story was about to intersect with someone else's in a way that would change everything. Sometimes the most important doors open when you're not even looking for them. Harris didn't believe in second chances, not for himself, and certainly not for others. At 73, he had built an empire on the principle that character revealed itself in the first impression, and rarely improved thereafter. His office on the 42nd floor of Harris Tower overlooked the city like a hawk surveying its territory, and he preferred it that way, distant, observant, uncompromising. He had made his fortune in commercial real estate, turning derelict properties into profitable ventures through sheer force of will and an almost supernatural ability to see potential where others saw only liability. But his greatest failure, he acknowledged in the privacy of his own thoughts, was his son. Frederick had been given every advantage, the best schools, the right connections, a clear path to leadership. Yet somewhere along the way, the boy had mistaken inheritance for achievement, entitlement for excellence. Their relationship had fractured years ago, not through any single dramatic confrontation, but through the slow erosion of respect. Harrison had watched his son coast through life on the family name, and it disgusted him. Now, as he reviewed quarterly reports from his various holdings, a name caught his attention. Miranda Foster. The operational manager at Lakeside Towers, one of his mid-tier properties. Her efficiency metrics were remarkable, tenant satisfaction up 17%, maintenance costs down 12%, all within her first 6 months. But it was the handwritten notes in her reports that intrigued him. She didn't just report numbers, she told stories. The elderly tenant on the 3rd floor who needed railings installed. The young family struggling with rent who she'd connected with a job placement program. The community garden she'd organized that had reduced vandalism by fostering neighborhood pride. Harrison made a note to visit the property. Randy was inspecting the lobby renovations when she noticed him. An older gentleman in an impeccable charcoal suit, standing by the new accent wall, running his hand along the textured surface with what appeared to be genuine interest. Something about his bearing suggested he wasn't a prospective tenant. "Can I help you?" she asked, approaching with her clipboard tucked under her arm. He turned, and his eyes, sharp, assessing, but not unkind, met hers. "Miranda Foster." "Randy, yes. And you are?" "Harrison Harris. I own the building." For a fraction of a second, Randy's composure wavered. Then she extended her hand. "Mr. Harris. I wasn't expecting you. If I'd known." "That's precisely why I didn't announce myself," he interrupted, shaking her hand with a firm grip. "I wanted to see the operation as it actually functions, not as it performs for inspection." "Well," Randy said, recovering her equilibrium, "what you see is what you get. We're in the middle of lobby improvements, all within budget, I should add, and if you'll follow me, I can show you the updated maintenance schedules and tenant feedback systems." Harrison followed her to her modest office, noting the efficiency of her movements, the way she greeted tenants by name in the hallways, how her eyes automatically scanned for details others would miss, a flickering light fixture, a loose carpet edge, a resident carrying heavy groceries who clearly needed help. Over the next hour, she walked him through her initiatives with a confidence born not from arrogance but from competence. She knew her numbers. More importantly, she knew her people. "You didn't go to college," Harrison observed, having reviewed her employment file. Randy stiffened slightly. "No, sir. Life had other plans. Yet you've implemented management strategies here that I've seen fail at properties run by MBA graduates." "How?" "I listen," she said simply. "To the tenants, to the maintenance staff, to what the building itself is telling me. And I believe that if you treat people with dignity and invest in their well-being, they'll invest back. A building isn't just brick and mortar. It's a community." Harrison nodded slowly. Something in this young woman reminded him of his younger self, the version of himself before wealth had built walls around his life. Their relationship evolved over the following months. Harrison began stopping by lakeside towers regularly, ostensibly to check on the property, but increasingly to discuss strategy with Randy. He recommended books on business theory. She shared insights about human nature that couldn't be learned from textbooks. They debated market trends over coffee in her cramped office, and Harrison found himself genuinely curious about her perspectives. One afternoon, as they reviewed expansion plans for the property, Harrison asked the question that had been nagging at him. "You've mentioned you were married before. If you don't mind my asking, what happened?" Randy's hand stilled on the documents. "I married young. Too young, probably. To someone who came from a different world than mine. It didn't work out." "His loss," Harrison said gruffly. "I thought so at the time. Now I think we were both just wrong for each other. He needed someone from his world. I needed someone who saw me as an equal partner, not a project to improve." Harrison absorbed this, feeling a flicker of something he couldn't quite name, admiration, certainly, but also a protective instinct he hadn't experienced in years. That evening, back in his office, he was reviewing correspondence when he came across an email from Frederick. The usual litany of complaints about the board, the usual requests for increased allowances. Harrison deleted it with disgust. His eye fell on a society page photograph attached to the bottom, Frederick at some charity gala, looking pleased with himself. And there, in faded marker on the margin where someone had cropped the image, a note in his assistant's handwriting, *, previous wife not pictured, Miranda Whitmore, divorced 2019. *. Harrison's blood went cold. Miranda Whitmore. Miranda Foster. The brilliant woman he'd been mentoring, seeing potential for real leadership, perhaps even considering for a significant role in his organization, she was Frederick's ex-wife. The woman his son had undoubtedly destroyed and discarded. The implications crashed over him like a wave. Harrison didn't sleep that night. He sat in his study, a glass of scotch untouched on the armrest, staring at the city lights below. The revelation about Randy's past marriage churned through his mind, raising questions he wasn't sure he wanted answered. Had Frederick broken her? Used her? Discarded her when she no longer served whatever shallow purpose she'd fulfilled in his life? But even as anger toward his son flared hot in his chest, another thought emerged, clearer and more insistent: Randy had survived. More than survived, she had rebuilt herself into someone extraordinary. Without bitterness poisoning her spirit, without using her pain as an excuse for mediocrity. She had done what Frederick never could, she had earned her place through merit. The next morning, Harrison arrived at Lakeside Towers earlier than usual. Randy was already in her office, reviewing vendor contracts, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up, surprised. "Mr. Harris. I wasn't expecting you until—" "I know about Frederick," he said quietly, closing the door behind him. The color drained from her face. Her hands gripped the edge of her desk. "I see. Why didn't you tell me? Would it have mattered?" Her voice was steady, but he could see the defensive walls rising. "Would you have believed I earned this position on my own merit if you'd known from the start? Or would you have seen me as another complication in your relationship with your son?" Harrison moved to the chair across from her desk and sat heavily. "I would have questioned your motives. I would have been wrong to do so, but yes, I would have questioned them. And now? Now I've spent months watching you work. I know who you are, Randy. The question is whether you can forgive me for being related to someone who clearly didn't." The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. "There's nothing to forgive. You're not responsible for your son's choices any more than I'm defined by my failed marriage." "Nevertheless," Harrison said, "I want you to know something. I'm estranged from Frederick because I cannot respect a man who mistakes privilege for accomplishment. I don't know the details of what happened between you, but I know my son. And I know you. Whatever he did, whatever he failed to see in you, that's his loss and his failure." Randy's eyes glistened, but she blinked the emotion back. "Thank you. That means more than you know." Their relationship shifted after that conversation, though neither acknowledged it aloud for weeks. Harrison began inviting Randy to meetings about his other properties, seeking her input on operations and strategy. She challenged his assumptions, pushed back on ideas she thought short-sighted, and brought a ground-level perspective that his executive team lacked. One evening, after a particularly productive strategy session at his office, Harrison poured 2 glasses of wine and gestured toward the balcony. The sunset painted the city in shades of amber and rose. "Can I ask you something personal?" Harrison said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "You've earned that right. Do you ever regret not having the conventional path? The college degree, the corner office by 30, all of it?" Randy considered the question, swirling the wine in her glass. "I used to. When I was married to Fred, I felt that lack constantly. Like I was always apologizing for not being enough. But now?" She shook her head. "The path I took taught me things no classroom could. About resilience. About human nature. About what actually matters when everything else is stripped away." "You're wise beyond your years," Harrison observed. "And you're reflective beyond your reputation," she countered with a slight smile. "The papers paint you as this ruthless tycoon. But I've seen you stop to talk to the maintenance staff. I've watched you implement the community programs I suggested without a second thought about profit margins. You care, Harrison. You just hide it behind spreadsheets and stern looks. He laughed, a genuine sound that surprised them both. Careful. You'll ruin my image. But as their eyes met in the fading light, something unspoken passed between them. An awareness. A possibility that both thrilled and terrified. The shift happened gradually, then all at once. Conversations stretched longer. Business dinners became less about business. Harrison found himself thinking about Randy at odd hours, wondering what she'd think about a new development deal, wanting to share small observations from his day. Randy, for her part, fought against what she was feeling. The age gap alone seemed insurmountable, 33 years separated them. And the moral implications haunted her. Falling for her ex-husband's father felt like something from a tawdry drama, not her carefully rebuilt life. One night, unable to sleep, she called her sister Maya. He's Fred's father, Maya. His father. So. Maya's pragmatic voice came through the phone. Is this about revenge? About hurting Fred? No, Randy said immediately. God, no. Fred doesn't even factor into how I feel. It's just. Harrison and I actually talk. He listens. He values my mind. He treats you like an equal, Maya finished. Unlike his son. Randy, if this were about revenge, you'd be bragging about it, using it as ammunition. Instead, you're scared because it's real. That's how you know it's right. Harrison was equally conflicted. He confessed his feelings to his oldest friend, Margaret, over lunch. I haven't felt this way in 20 years, he admitted. Not since Catherine passed. But the optics. Optics? Margaret interrupted. Harrison, you've never cared about optics. You've built your entire life on substance over appearance. Don't start compromising now. She deserves someone who can give her decades, not years. She deserves someone who sees her value. Who challenges her. Who respects her. Age is just one factor, Harrison. It's not the only one that matters. The evening Harrison asked Randy to dinner, not a business dinner, he clarified carefully, they both knew what it meant. They chose a quiet restaurant far from social circles, where they could simply be two people exploring an unexpected connection. I need you to know, Harrison said over dessert, his hand covering hers on the table, this isn't casual for me. I'm too old for games, too set in my ways to change easily. If we do this, I'm all in. But I also need you to be certain. Because once we start down this path, there's no going back to what we were. Randy turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. I'm certain. Scared, yes. Worried about what people will say, absolutely. But certain about this, about you, yes. 3 months later, in the same quiet office where they'd first discussed business strategies, Harrison asked her to marry him. No ring yet, they would choose that together. No grand gestures or orchestrated moments. Just a simple question from a man who had finally found someone who matched him in every way that mattered. I love you for who you are, not despite your past but including it, he said. You've taught me that it's never too late to reconsider what I thought I knew about success, about family, about love. Will you marry me? Randy said yes. Not because it would hurt Frederick, he was irrelevant to this decision. But because she had found what she'd always deserved, a partner who saw her clearly and chose her anyway. Love rooted in respect, she was learning, could weather any storm. Frederick Harris stood in the grand ballroom of the Ashford estate, surveying his kingdom. Crystal chandeliers cast prismatic light across marble floors. Ice sculptures flanked the entrance. The guest list read like a social register: politicians, celebrities, old money, new money, all the right people bearing witness to his triumph. His bride-to-be, Clarissa van der Berg, was everything Randy hadn't been: trust fund, boarding school pedigree, a last name that opened doors before she even entered the room. The wedding would be covered in 3 major society publications. It was, Frederick thought with satisfaction, exactly what his life was supposed to look like. The seating chart needs adjustment, his wedding planner said, tablet in hand. You have someone listed as attending alone, a Miranda Foster. Frederick smiled. Yes. Leave that exactly as it is. Table 17, toward the back. He debated whether to invite her at all. Part of him wanted to pretend she'd never existed, to erase that embarrassing chapter entirely. But another part, the part that still nursed the wound of her walking away from him, wanted her to see what she'd lost. Wanted her to sit in that ballroom, alone and insignificant, watching him marry someone from his own world. Someone appropriate. The invitation had been deliberate. Formal enough to seem gracious, but with a sting hidden in the elegant calligraphy: Mr. Frederick Harris III requests the honor of your presence, no +1 offered. A single seat at a table with distant acquaintances who wouldn't know her, wouldn't include her in their conversations about summer homes in the Hamptons and winters in Gestad. He imagined her receiving it. Imagined her hands trembling as she read it. Would she cry? Would she decline out of humiliation? Or would she come, foolish enough to think she could hold her head high while watching him pledge forever to someone better? Either way, Frederick won. The invitation arrived at Randy's apartment on a Tuesday afternoon, delivered by courier in a heavy cream envelope with a wax seal. She opened it while still standing in her doorway, mail and groceries balanced in her other arm. She read it once. Then again. Then she set it calmly on her kitchen counter and put away the groceries. That evening, Harrison noticed it when he came by for dinner. They'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm of splitting time between his penthouse and her apartment, both enjoying the normalcy of cooking together, of quiet evenings without pretense. That arrived today, Randy said, nodding toward the invitation as she chopped vegetables. Harrison picked it up, his jaw tightening as he read. He invited you to his wedding. Apparently. This is a power play. He wants you to feel small. Yes, I know. Randy set down her knife and turned to face him. He wants me to show up alone, watch him marry someone from his approved social stratum, and feel like I lost something valuable. It's very Fred. You're not going. It wasn't a question, but there was uncertainty in Harrison's eyes. Randy considered. A month ago, even a week ago, she would have declined immediately. Thrown the invitation away, refused to give Frederick the satisfaction. But something had shifted in her. She'd spent years rebuilding herself, proving her worth, finding love with a man who valued her completely. Frederick's opinion of her didn't matter anymore, not because she was pretending it didn't, but because it genuinely, truly didn't. Actually, she said slowly, I think I want to go. Harrison set down the invitation. Why? Closure, maybe. Or maybe just to prove to myself that I've moved past it. That I can walk into that room and feel nothing but gratitude that I escaped. She moved closer to him, taking his hands. But I won't go alone. Understanding dawned in Harrison's expression, followed by concern. Randy, if we attend together, it will cause a scene. Frederick will. Will what? Be angry that his ex-wife found happiness with someone who actually respects her. Be humiliated that his father chose her over maintaining their already fractured relationship. She shook her head. Harrison, I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing this because I'm genuinely happy now, and I refused to hide that happiness to protect Frederick's ego. Harrison studied her face, searching for any hint of vindictiveness, any desire to wound. He found none. What he saw instead was a woman who had genuinely healed, who had moved forward with such completeness that facing her past held no terror. "If we do this," he said carefully, "there's no going back. Whatever relationship I have left with Frederick, minimal as it is, will be destroyed. I know. And I won't ask you to sacrifice that for me. If you think there's any chance of reconciliation with your son, I'll go alone or not at all." Harrison pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. He thought of Frederick, the disappointment, the wasted potential, the years of trying to instill values that never took root. Then he thought of the woman in his arms, who had built herself from nothing into someone remarkable. "There is no relationship to salvage," he said quietly. "There hasn't been for years. I've been holding on to the ghost of a son I wanted, not the man he actually is." He pulled back to look at her. "If you want to go, we go together. But we do it with dignity. No grand entrances, no spectacles. We simply attend as the couple we are." Randy smiled. "Agreed." The week before the wedding, Harrison made arrangements. A black luxury sedan, understated but unmistakably expensive. Matching outfits, Randy in an elegant navy dress that spoke of quiet confidence, Harrison in his customary impeccable suit. They would arrive neither early nor late, draw no unnecessary attention, and conduct themselves with the grace that came from having nothing to prove. The night before the wedding, as Randy laid out her dress, she felt no anxiety. No desire for revenge. No need to make Frederick see what he'd lost. She had already won, she realized. Not because she'd found someone richer or more powerful, though Harrison was both. But because she'd found someone who saw her completely and loved what he saw. Someone who chose her not despite her lack of pedigree, but without even considering it relevant. Frederick had set his trap carefully, expecting to catch her in humiliation. He had no idea that he'd built it for himself. The Ashford estate gleamed in the late afternoon sun, transformed into a monument to excess. A crimson carpet stretched from the circular drive to the entrance, flanked by photographers and society reporters documenting every arrival. White roses, thousands of them, cascaded from archways and wrapped around columns. Violinists played pichelbel under a silk pavilion. Valets rushed to attend each arriving luxury vehicle while guests in designer gowns and bespoke suits air-kissed and compared vacation homes. Frederick stood near the entrance in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, greeting guests with the practiced charm of someone who had never questioned his place in the world. Clarissa was upstairs still, being fussed over by a team of stylists, but Frederick enjoyed this part, the reception line, the admiring glances, the whispered recognition of his name and status. He checked his watch. Most guests had arrived. Table 17, Randy's table, remained empty. Part of him felt disappointed. He'd wanted her to see this. But perhaps her absence was victory enough, she'd been too ashamed to attend. Then he heard it. A change in the murmur of the crowd. A shift in energy near the entrance. The black Mercedes S-Class pulled to a stop at the red carpet's end. Not the flashiest car in the procession, several Bentleys and a Rolls-Royce had already arrived, but there was something commanding about its understated elegance. The valet opened the rear door. A woman's hand emerged first, accepting the valet's assistance. Then a leg, clad in a gold stiletto that caught the sunlight. And then Randy stepped out. She wore a floor-length dress in champagne gold that moved like liquid metal, elegant without being ostentatious. Her hair was swept up in a classic style that showcased the simple diamond earrings, Harrison's gift, at her ears. But it wasn't the dress or the jewelry that made people stare. It was the way she carried herself, poised, serene, utterly comfortable in her own skin. The cameras began clicking immediately, society photographers recognizing a compelling image even if they didn't yet know who she was. Then Harrison emerged from the other side of the car. The clicking intensified into a frenzy. Harrison Harris rarely attended social events. His public appearances were limited to business conferences and charity galas he personally funded. His presence at Frederick's wedding, at any wedding, was newsworthy on its own. But when he rounded the car and offered Randy his arm, when she took it with a natural grace that spoke of genuine intimacy rather than performance, the atmosphere shifted from curiosity to shock. Frederick felt the blood drain from his face. No. No, this couldn't be. Harrison and Randy walked the red carpet together, unhurried. They paused for photographs like any other couple, Harrison's hand resting protectively on the small of her back, Randy smiling with quiet confidence at the cameras. "Mr. Harris," a reporter called out. "Who is your companion?" Harrison turned, meeting the camera with the same stern expression he used in boardroom negotiations. "This is Miranda Foster," he said clearly, his voice carrying across the suddenly hushed crowd. "My fiancé." The word detonated like a bomb. Guests who'd been mid-conversation stopped talking. Someone dropped a champagne flute. The violinists faltered for half a measure before recovering. Frederick couldn't move. Couldn't breathe. His mind raced through impossible calculations, his father with Randy. His father with his ex-wife. When had this, how long had they? Fred. His mother's best friend, Patricia, materialized at his elbow, her face pale. "Did you know about this?" No, Frederick's carefully constructed composure shattered. "Excuse me." He crossed toward them with quick, sharp strides that made guests step back. Harrison saw him coming and squared his shoulders, but didn't move to intercept. Randy simply watched Frederick approach, her expression neutral. "What the hell is this?" Frederick hissed, his voice low enough to avoid the nearest photographers but sharp enough to cut. "What kind of sick game?" "Frederick." Harrison's voice held a warning. "We're at your wedding. Keep your voice down." "My wedding? You show up to my wedding with her, and expect me to?" "We were invited," Randy said calmly. "You sent me an invitation, Fred. Remember? Or did you expect me to arrive alone so you could enjoy my humiliation?" Frederick's face flushed red. You're doing this to hurt me. To embarrass me in front of everyone." "Actually," Harrison said, his tone measured but unyielding, "we're here because Randy wanted closure. Your feelings didn't factor into our decision at all, Frederick. Just as her feelings clearly didn't factor into yours when you sent that invitation. She was nothing when I married her. A waitress. And now you, my own father. She is brilliant, hardworking, and more successful than you've ever been without a family name propping you up," Harrison interrupted. "I didn't choose Randy to hurt you. I chose her because she's extraordinary. Your inability to see that says everything about you and nothing about her." Guests were openly staring now. Some had phones out, recording. The photographer from Vanity Fair was capturing every moment. Clarissa appeared at the top of the stairs in her Vera Wang gown, having been summoned by a frantic bridesmaid. She took in the scene, her groom confronting an older man and a beautiful woman, the crowd's shocked faces, the cameras documenting everything. "Frederick?" Her voice carried down the stairs. "What's happening?" Frederick turned, trapped between his bride and his father, between the life he'd staged and the truth he couldn't control. "It's nothing. Just." "That's Harrison Harris," someone whispered loudly enough for Clarissa to hear. Frederick's father. With Frederick's ex-wife. Clarissa's hand went to her throat. She descended 3 steps, then stopped, her extensive bridal train pooling behind her. Is that true? The question hung in the air. Frederick opened his mouth, closed it. What could he say? What explanation could possibly make this acceptable? Randy felt a wave of something unexpected, not satisfaction, but sadness. Sadness for Frederick, who had learned nothing. Sadness for Clarissa, whose perfect day was imploding through no fault of her own. Sadness for the waste of it all. We should go, she said quietly to Harrison. We shouldn't have come. No, Clarissa descended the remaining stairs, her voice stronger now. Stay. Please. She approached them with her chin raised, every inch the daughter of old money. I want to understand what's happening at my wedding. She looked at Frederick, waiting for an explanation. When none came, she turned to Randy. You were married to Frederick? Yes. Years ago. It ended badly. And now you're engaged to his father. Yes. Clarissa absorbed this, her expression unreadable. Then she looked at Frederick, really looked at him, as if seeing something clearly for the first time. Did you invite her here to humiliate her? Clarissa, it's not. Did you? The silence was answer enough. Clarissa took a step back, her hand trembling as she gripped her bouquet. I need a moment, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Everyone, please, I need a moment. She turned and walked back toward the house, her steps measured despite the chaos erupting in whispers around her. Frederick started after her. Clarissa, wait. But she didn't wait. She disappeared inside, leaving Frederick standing alone on his red carpet, surrounded by 300 witnesses to his humiliation. The trap he'd set had sprung shut. And he was the only one caught inside. Harrison placed his hand gently on Randy's elbow. We should leave, he said quietly, his voice meant only for her. She nodded. They hadn't come to destroy Frederick's wedding, only to attend it as the people they'd become. But the destruction had happened anyway, not through their actions, but through the simple truth of their presence. As they turned toward the exit, Randy caught Frederick's eye one last time. She expected to see rage there, or humiliation, or even hatred. Instead, she saw something far more unsettling, confusion. The look of a man who had followed a script his entire life only to discover the pages were blank. She felt no triumph. No satisfaction. Only a quiet relief that she was no longer trapped in his orbit. They walked back down the red carpet together, past guests who parted like water, past photographers who had lowered their cameras in stunned silence. The black Mercedes waited where they'd left it, and within moments they were pulling away from the Ashford estate, leaving the wreckage behind them. Are you all right? Harrison asked as the estate disappeared from view. Randy considered the question. I thought I'd feel something more. Victory, maybe, or vindication. But I just feel free. Like I finally closed a door I'd been leaving cracked open without realizing it. Harrison took her hand, bringing it to his lips. That's what healing looks like. Not fanfare. Just peace. Inside the estate, Frederick stood alone in the center of his carefully orchestrated celebration. Guests had retreated to polite distances, forming small clusters where they whispered behind champagne flutes. He could feel their judgment, their fascination with his downfall, their eagerness to spread this story through their social circles. Patricia approached cautiously. Frederick, perhaps you should check on Clarissa. He climbed the stairs mechanically, each step heavier than the last. He found Clarissa in the bridal suite, seated in front of the vanity mirror, still wearing her veil. Her makeup artist and bridesmaids had been dismissed. She sat perfectly still, staring at her reflection. "Clarissa," Frederick began, his voice catching. "I can explain." "Can you?" She didn't turn to face him. "Can you explain why you invited your ex-wife to our wedding? Why you seated her alone at a back table? What you hoped would happen?" "I wanted her to see," he stopped, the words dying in his throat. What had he wanted? For Randy to feel small. To validate his choice to leave her. To prove he'd upgraded. "You wanted her to feel inferior," Clarissa finished. "You wanted her to watch you marry me and feel like she'd lost something valuable." She finally turned, and her eyes were clear, devastated but clear. "That's cruel, Frederick. And it's small." "She walked away from me," he said, but even to his own ears it sounded hollow. "She left. Because you made her feel worthless." "I can see that now." Clarissa stood, her gown rustling. "I've spent 6 months planning this wedding. 6 months excited to marry you. And in 5 minutes, I learned more about your character than I did in 2 years of dating. So what, you're calling off the wedding? Over her?" Desperation crept into his voice. "Over who you are when you think no one's watching." She moved to the window, looking down at the confused guests milling below. "You didn't invite her for closure or kindness. You invited her to hurt her. That's who you are, Frederick. And I won't marry someone like that." She walked past him toward the door, then paused. "The marriage to your father, that clearly wasn't revenge. Did you see her face? She looked at him the way I thought you looked at me. Like he was her equal. Her partner." Clarissa's voice broke slightly. "You never looked at me that way. I was just another acquisition. The right pedigree, the right family, the right image for your life." "That's not true." But she was already gone, her train whispering across the floor like a final goodbye. Frederick stood in the empty bridal suite, his reflection multiplied in the vanity mirrors. He saw what Clarissa had seen, a man in an expensive tuxedo with nothing substantial beneath the surface. A man who had confused his father's legacy with his own worth, who had mistaken a family name for a personality. For the first time in his life, Frederick Harris III was forced to confront what remained when you stripped away the privilege, the connections, the inherited fortune. He found nothing there. The realization didn't come as a dramatic epiphany. It arrived quietly, like a door closing in an empty house. He had spent his entire life performing the role of a successful man without ever doing the work to become one. Randy had done that work. Built herself from nothing into someone his father respected, admired, loved. And Frederick, with every advantage, every opportunity, had built nothing but facades. The guests would leave. The photographers would publish their stories. Clarissa would move on to someone who valued her. His father would continue forward with Randy, building a life based on genuine partnership. And Frederick would remain exactly where he was, alone, with only his pride for company. Pride, he was learning, made for cold comfort. 6 months later, Randy stood in the penthouse she now shared with Harrison, looking out at the city lights. They'd married quietly in a small ceremony with only close friends and Maya's family present. No photographers, no society pages, no performance. Harrison came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "Frederick, actually," she admitted. "I heard through Maya that he's in therapy now. Started after the wedding fell apart. How does that make you feel?" "Hopeful, I think. Not for us, there's no us, but hopeful that he might actually figure himself out. That something good might come from all that pain." Harrison kissed her temple. You're remarkably generous. I'm remarkably happy, she corrected. It's easy to be generous when you have nothing left to prove. She turned in his arms, looking up at the man who had chosen her not despite her past but including it. Who had taught her that respect was the foundation of real love, that partnership meant two whole people choosing each other, not one person trying to fix or elevate the other. Do you ever regret it? She asked. Losing whatever relationship you had left with Frederick. I regret that I couldn't teach him what he needed to know. But I don't regret choosing you. Not for a moment. Randy leaned into him, feeling the peace that came from being fully known and fully loved. She had started as a waitress marrying above her station. She had been broken down, divorced, left to rebuild. And she had rebuilt herself into someone who didn't need revenge because she had something far more powerful, dignity, self-respect, and the quiet knowledge that she had always been enough. The ultimate victory, she had learned, wasn't in making someone see what they'd lost. It was in becoming so completely yourself that their opinion no longer mattered. That was true freedom. And she wore it like a crown.